The topic of today's module is implementing stimulus control transfer procedures. This module will cover task list item C8, which is part of the skill acquisition category. We will also be reviewing C9, which is implementing prompt and prompt fading procedures, as prompts directly relate to stimulus control transfer procedures. This training program is based on the RBT task list and is designed to meet the 40-hour training requirement for RBT certification. The program is offered independent of the BACB. In this presentation, we will cover what stimulus control is, prompting methods, and prompt fading methods, and these will be related back to implementing stimulus control transfer procedures. At the end of the presentation, there will be references. First, we will discuss what stimulus control is. So what is stimulus control? As stated in the Principles of Behavior by Millant and Shane, 2014, stimulus control is the occurrence of a response more frequently in the presence of one stimulus than in the presence of another, usually as a result of a discrimination training procedure. And according to Grain 2001, the goal of all instruction is to get specific responses to occur reliably under particular antecedent stimulus conditions and not under other conditions. As we discuss stimulus control, it is also important to discuss the SD and the S delta. The SD, also known as a discriminative stimulus, is a stimulus in the presence of which a response will be reinforced or punished. The S delta is a stimulus in the presence of which a response will not be reinforced or punished. In order for stimulus control to occur, discrimination training must take place. Discrimination training is reinforcing or punishing a response in the presence of one stimulus and extinguishing it or allowing it to recover in the presence of another stimulus. Through discrimination training, a response occurs in the presence of one stimulus and not in the presence of another. This is also known as stimulus control. Let's look at a diagrammed contingency for imitating tapping. In the presence of the SD, the technician saying, "Do this" while tapping the table, the child's table tapping results in a reinforcer, which is an M&M. In comparison, if the child tapped the table when the technician said, "Do this" while raising arms up, that response would not result in a reinforcer. We want the model of tapping the table to control the child's imitation response of tapping the table. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. What is stimulus control? I'll now give you time to get that question filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in the occurrence of a response more frequently in the presence of one stimulus than in the presence of another, usually as a result of a discrimination training procedure. I'll now give you some time to get that filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. What is discrimination training? I'll now give you a moment to fill that question in. On your homework sheet, fill in the following answer: reinforcing or punishing a response in the presence of one stimulus and extinguishing it or allowing it to recover in the presence of another stimulus. I'll now give you a moment to fill that in. Now let's talk about stimulus control and prompts. Prompts should only be used during the acquisition of a skill or behavior. Stimulus control should be transferred from the prompt to the naturally existing stimulus or stimuli quickly, using prompt fading. For the previous example, a prompt could be to physically prompt the child to tap the table. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question: true or false? Stimulus control should be transferred from the prompt to the naturally existing stimulus or stimuli quickly using prompt fading. I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. True. You want to fade out prompts quickly in order to transfer stimulus control to the naturally existing stimulus. On your homework sheet, fill in true. There are some important factors that affect stimulus control. This includes consistent use of reinforcers contingent on correct responses in the presence of the SD, as well as pre-attending skills, stimulus salience, and masking and overshadowing, which we will get into in the next couple of slides. Some pre-attending skills that the child should have prior to working on stimulus control procedures would include looking at instructional materials, as well as scanning the array, looking at the technician, listening to oral instructions, as well as sitting quietly for short periods of time. These are skills that should be taught prior to implementing stimulus control procedures. Stimulus salience is the prominence of the stimulus in the environment. An increased saliency facilitates efficiency of instruction. Masking and overshadowing decrease the saliency of stimuli. The discriminative stimulus that should evoke the response is blocked by competing stimuli or other stimuli in the environment. In masking, one stimulus has acquired stimulus control over a behavior. However, a competing stimulus may block the evocative effect of that stimulus. An example could be seen in a receptive identification task. You may have worked on teaching receptive identification with an array of a snake, book, and doll. After the child met the mastery criterion, new stimuli such as car and pig may be added to the array. If the child's preferred toy is a car, they may select the car on each trial, regardless of what the discriminative stimulus is, and even though they responded correctly to snake, book, and doll during previous sessions. The card decreases the saliency of the discriminative stimuli snake, book, and doll. Overshadowing is when one stimulus interferes with the acquisition of stimulus control of another stimulus. This could be seen if you were conducting trials in the hallway when other kids were there. The other kids may be more salient stimuli, visually and auditorily, and may overshadow your discriminative stimulus, such as sit down. To limit the negative effects of these, you could rearrange the environment, make instructional stimuli more intense, and consistently reinforce behavior in the presence of instructionally relevant stimuli. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. What is one factor that affects stimulus control? I'll now give you a moment to fill that question in. On your homework sheet, fill in one of the following answers. Consistent use of reinforcers contingent on correct responses in the presence of the SD, pre-attending skills, stimulus salience, or masking and overshadowing. I'll now give you a moment to fill one of those in. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. What are the pre-attending skills that were discussed? I'll now give you a moment to fill that question in. On your homework sheet, fill in looking at instructional materials, looking at technician, listening to oral instructions, and sitting quietly for short periods of time. I'll now give you a moment to fill that in. Now let's get into prompts, which should be a review. So why do we use prompts? We use prompts to get behavior to occur in the presence of the stimulus we want to acquire stimulus control, the desired discriminative stimulus, because that desired discriminative stimulus is not controlling the behavior currently. The behavior has to occur in the presence of the desired discriminative stimulus and be reinforced in order for that discriminative stimulus to gain stimulus control. This is why we repeat the instruction each time we prompt, so that when the child emits the behavior, it is in the presence of the stimulus we want to control the behavior, the instruction. If we only said it once and we had to go through 3 different prompt levels until the child did the correct response, The instruction may have been said 30 seconds ago, and it is unlikely that it will gain stimulus control. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. Is it important for the behavior to occur and be reinforced in the presence of the SD? I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. Yes, the behavior has to occur and be reinforced in the presence of that stimulus in order for the SD to gain stimulus control. On your homework sheet, fill in yes. What is a prompt? A prompt is a supplemental stimulus that increases the probability of a correct response. An effective prompting strategy should be identified to minimize errors. According to McDuff and colleagues in 2001, errors often interfere with acquisition, generalization, and maintenance of skills. Is there such a thing as ineffective prompts? If a prompt isn't working, is it still a prompt? No. According to Kogel, Russo, Brinkover, and Friedman in 1982, it is not a prompt if it is not effective. You should change your prompt if it isn't working, or you should talk to your supervisor about changing prompts. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. What is a prompt? And then read through the multiple choice possibilities to determine which one is the correct response. Is it A, error correction, B, a supplemental stimulus that increases the probability of a correct response, or C, a stimulus in the presence of which a response will be reinforced or punished? Again, on your homework sheet, you only have to fill in the following question. What is a prompt? On your homework sheet, fill in B, a supplemental stimulus that increases the probability of a correct response. I'll now give you some time to get that filled in. Homework sheet, fill in the following question. What is a stimulus in the presence of which a response will be reinforced or punished? I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. The answer is a discriminative stimulus, also known as an SD. On your homework sheet, fill in SD. Now let's compare prompts and error correction. Prompts are antecedent stimuli as they occur before the behavior to increase the likelihood of a correct response. A most to least prompting hierarchy is often used as a prompting method, as a more intrusive prompt is provided prior to the response, decreasing the likelihood of errors. We will discuss most to least prompting methods more in a little bit. Error correction pertains to the consequent stimuli as they occur after an error has been made. A least to most error correction hierarchy is typically used as an error correction method, as the child has the opportunity to independently respond, and error correction only starts after an error is made. we will discuss least to most prompting methods more in a little bit. Two categories of prompts exist: response prompts and stimulus prompts. Response prompts operate directly on the response. They are stimuli that are added to the discriminative stimulus that allow direct manipulations of the response and may include verbal, model, and physical prompts. Stimulus prompts operate directly on the antecedent task stimuli. They are manipulations of the antecedent task stimuli that evoke the response and may include movement, position, and redundancy of antecedent stimuli. On your homework sheet, write response prompts operate, and then fill in the blanks with the answer. I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. You should have written directly on the response, so that your statement says response prompts operate directly on the response. If you made any errors, please fix them now, so that your statement says response prompts operate directly on the response. On your homework sheet, write in stimulus prompts operate, and then fill in the blanks with your answer. I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. You should have written directly on the antecedent task stimuli, so that your statement says stimulus prompts operate directly on the antecedent task stimuli. If you made any errors, please fix them now, so that your statement says stimulus prompts operate directly on the antecedent task stimuli. Now we will discuss types of prompts, both response prompts and stimulus prompts. Response prompts examples would include vocal, textual or pictorial, model, and physical prompts. These prompts are response prompts because they operate directly on the response. Stimulus prompts could be within stimulus or extra stimulus. Within stimulus prompts involve a prompt relevant to, embedded within the training stimulus. And extra stimulus prompts involve adding a stimulus not relevant to the training stimuli to increase the likelihood of a correct response, according to Schriebman, 1975. Examples of within stimulus prompts would be redundancy of stimulus color, size, or shape, relevant to and embedded within the training stimulus. This could be making the color of the target stimulus more intense than the other stimuli, or making the target stimulus larger. Examples of extra stimulus prompts would be gestural prompts, positional, color, or shape. Vocal prompts are an example of response prompts as they act directly on the response. For example, a child may be working on clapping hands in the presence of a peer dunking a basketball, which is the SD. If the clapping doesn't occur, a vocal prompt, clap hands, may be provided. That vocal prompt acted directly on the response of clapping hands. Another example of a response prompt would be textual or pictorial prompts. If the student can't read, textual prompts would not be suitable, as reading is a prerequisite for textual prompts. An example of textual and pictorial prompts could be a task analysis. For example, if a child had dirty hands, which is the SD, a visual task analysis could be provided to prompt through the behavior chain of washing hands. As you can see here, this visual task analysis prompts each of the responses within that behavior chain. Another example of a response prompt would be a model prompt. An example of this would be if a child was given the instruction, clap hands, which would be the SD, and they didn't clap their hands. The technician could repeat the SD, clap hands, while modeling clapping hands. This would operate directly on the response of clapping hands, evoking that response. The final example of response prompts that we will talk about is physical prompts. This would mean physically guiding the child to engage in the correct response. For an example, in a receptive identification task, if an array of pictures was presented to the child and the technician stated bus, they could physically guide the student to select the bus, as you can see here in this animation. Now we will discuss stimulus prompts. Redundancy of antecedent stimuli as a stimulus prompt involves manipulating the color or size of the antecedent stimulus. As you can see here, the target picture, which is bus, is full colored, while the other pictures, which are fork, shoe, and pen, are less intense. This is an example of a within stimulus prompt. This is an example of an extra stimulus prompt. In a receptive identification task, the technician could state the SD, which is bus, while also gesturing to the correct stimulus, the bus. This would prompt the child to respond to that stimulus by selecting the bus. A positional or proximity prompt is another example of an extra stimulus prompt. In a receptive identification task, where SOC is the SD, the position of the target stimulus, SOC, could be closer to the child while the other stimuli are in a straight line. This would prompt the child to select the SOC. Color could be used as an extra stimulus prompt. Here is another receptive identification example. As you can see here, the background of the target stimulus, pen, which matches the SD, is red. That background could prompt the child to select that stimulus that corresponds to the discriminative stimulus, pen. You could add a shape to the target stimulus as an extra stimulus prompt. Here, a star was added to the target stimulus, fork. This is another receptive identification example where the discriminative stimulus is fork. So by adding that star to that fork stimulus in the array, it increases the likelihood that the child will select the fork. On your homework sheet, fill in, what is an example of a response prompt? I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in either vocal, textual or pictorial, model, or physical. I'll now give you some time to get one of those filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in, what is an example of a stimulus prompt? And I'll give you some time to get that question filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in either redundancy, positional, color, or shape. I'll now give you time to get one of those filled in. When considering prompting strategies, it is also important to consider the limitations. Prompt dependency is when a person doesn't respond to the stimuli desired to evoke a response and instead respond only in the presence of the prompt. Stimulus overselectivity is when a stimulus prompt is used that contains multiple components and the individual only responds to a component of that stimulus prompt. The development of error patterns includes stimulus and position biases. Faulty stimulus control is when the child's response is controlled by irrelevant or extraneous stimuli, not the relevant stimuli. For example, if during a matching trial, the child selected the object that you placed last rather than the object that matched the one you were holding up, that would be faulty stimulus control. The response is controlled by the placement of the objects, not by the desired discriminative stimulus. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. What do we mean by prompt dependent? I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. The child only responds in the presence of the prompt. The child has a history of waiting for a prompt in order to receive the reinforcer, or in order to receive an easier response that will lead to a reinforcer. On your homework sheet, fill in the child only responds in the presence of the prompt. I'll now give you some time to get that filled in. Now let's review prompt fading, which is important to consider anytime you are incorporating prompting strategies in your intervention. As I just said, with the addition of a prompt, it is critical to consider the prompt fading strategy so that the response comes under the control of the desired antecedent stimulus, the discriminative stimulus, or SD. So prompt fading facilitates the transfer of stimulus control from the prompt to the SD and decreases the likelihood of prompt dependence, stimulus overselectivity, as well as development of error patterns. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. Why is prompt fading important? I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in prompt fading facilitates the transfer of stimulus control from the prompt to the SD. I'll now give you some time to get that filled in. Here are some examples of prompt fading, which we will go more in depth with in a few slides. Some examples of response prompt fading include most to least, graduated guidance, least to most, and time delay. Examples of stimulus prompt fading include stimulus fading as well as stimulus shaping. Starting off with the most to least prompting hierarchy. This is where you physically guide the child through the complete response, and then you gradually decrease the amount of physical assistance. An example of this would be starting with a physical prompt, moving into a model prompt, and then providing only a vocal prompt, until finally the natural stimulus, or the desired discriminative stimulus, is controlling the response. Some advantages of most to least prompt fading is that there are less errors and less trials to mastery. However, if the more intrusive prompts are not faded out quickly, the prompting hierarchy can lead to prompt dependence. Another example of response prompt fading is graduated guidance. In graduated guidance, only physical prompts are used. You immediately fade the physical prompt by following the child closely so that the physical prompt could be provided if necessary. You gradually increase the distance between your hands and the child. Another example of response prompt fading would be a least to most prompting hierarchy. As we stated earlier, a least to most prompting hierarchy could also be seen as error correction, as you first wait for an error to be made prior to introducing a prompt. Within a least to most prompting hierarchy, you allow the child to independently respond. After incorrect responses are made, you would provide greater degrees of assistance until a correct response is made. For example, if an incorrect response is made, you could provide a gestural or model prompt. If a correct response is still not made, then you would go into a partial physical prompt. If a correct response is still not made to that partial physical prompt, then you would provide a full physical prompt, where you hand over hand prompt the child to engage in the correct response. According to McDuff and colleagues, errors often interfere with acquisition, generalization, and maintenance of skills, and least to most prompting systems consistently produce more errors than most to least prompting systems. Typically, when there are more errors, there is less reinforcement and more problem behavior, as more trials to mastery. These are important to consider when choosing a prompting and prompt fading strategy. Another example of response prompt fading is time delay. In a time delay, you increase the time interval between the presentation of the natural stimulus or discriminative stimulus and the presentation of a response prompt. A time delay could be constant or progressive. In a constant time delay, you start with a 0-second delay and then use a fixed delay between the discriminative stimulus and the response prompt. In a progressive time delay, you start with a 0-second delay and then gradually and systematically increase that delay according to some rule. Now we are going to discuss stimulus prompt fading. One example of stimulus prompt fading is stimulus fading. Within stimulus fading, the physical dimension of a stimulus is highlighted or exaggerated and then gradually faded. Or one stimulus is superimposed on top of another and then gradually faded out. Stimulus fading is a most to least prompting system, an errorless teaching method. It involves overemphasizing a physical dimension of a stimulus, for example, intensity or size, as a prompt for the learner to engage in the correct response, and then fading out that overemphasized physical dimension to facilitate the transfer of stimulus control from the prompt to the desired controlling stimulus, the SD. This is according to McDuff and colleagues 2001 and Green 2001. Stimulus fading has been used to teach the discrimination of length, size, and numerosity, spatial relations, letters and words, shapes, or other configurations and sounds, according to Lencioni and Smeets, 1986. This is an example of stimulus fading along the color or intensity dimension for a receptive identification task. In this example, the discriminative stimulus is the auditory stimulus, bus. So you can see the technician saying bus. And the corresponding comparison stimulus in the array is full color, while the other stimuli are not. This is a prompt for the child to select that stimulus that corresponds to that discriminative stimulus. With stimulus fading, it is better to exaggerate the relevant features of the stimulus and fade to normal rather than add irrelevant features and fade them. So if you wanted to teach a child to receptively identify objects or pictures, you would fade out the ones that aren't the target stimulus. Also note that when you are actually teaching this, you would not teach one color or one stimulus in isolation, but you would rotate between the stimuli. In the next couple of slides, we will see an example of stimulus fading occurring. As you can see, these pictures are the same pictures that were included in the last array that we looked at. These pictures are more intense, however, and more similar to the positive comparison stimulus, which is the target, as the color and intensity of those stimuli has faded in. This is an example of stimulus fading along the size dimension. In this example, which is a receptive identification task, the discriminative stimulus is the auditory stimulus, fork, and the stimulus in the array that corresponds to that discriminative stimulus is larger than the other stimuli. The size of the target card, or the card that corresponds to the discriminative stimulus, would systematically get smaller as correct responses were made until all cards were the same size. Again, with this, you wouldn't want to teach fork in isolation, but rotate between all of the stimuli in the array. Here, the pen is the target and is still slightly larger than the other cards, though smaller than the fork on the previous slide. Stimulus fading can be used across a variety of dimensions, including intensity, size, position, and more. You have just seen examples of stimulus fading across intensity as well as size. Another example of stimulus prompt fading would be stimulus shaping. In stimulus shaping, the initial stimulus shape prompts a correct response, and then that shape is gradually changed from the prompt to the natural stimulus as correct responses occur. Both of these examples of stimulus shaping are from Cooper, Heron, and Heward, 2007. For the first example, there are two pictures loosely in the shape of a 2. Over trials, the two pictures become an actual number 2. In the second example, the car systematically is changed from a car to the letters C-A-R. On your homework sheet, fill in what is an example of response prompt fading. I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in either most to least, or MTL, graduated guidance, least to most, or LTM, or time delay. I'll now give you some time to get that filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in what is an example of stimulus prompt fading. I'll now give you some time to get that question filled in. On your homework sheet, fill in either stimulus fading or stimulus shaping. I'll now give you some time to get that filled in. In addition to prompt fading strategies, another way to transfer stimulus control from a prompt to the desired discriminative stimulus is through the use of transfer trials. After an incorrect response, when the child had an independent opportunity to respond, a prompt is provided. After the prompted response, you would immediately present another trial or another independent opportunity to respond. It is likely that the child will respond correctly during that independent opportunity as they just engaged in the same prompted response. When using transfer trials, typically data is not taken on the transfer trial, but rather just taken on that initial incorrect response. Sometimes you may provide a distractor trial, which is a previously mastered learning opportunity, in between the prompted trial and allowing the opportunity to independently respond.
Do this. Do this. Good. Do this. Do this. Good. Do this. Good job. Do this. Do this. Good. Do this. Nice job.
In the first video, the child had 3 opportunities to respond. They didn't respond the first time, so a prompt was provided. They were given another opportunity to respond and still did not, so another prompt was provided. On the third opportunity to respond independently, they did so and received a reinforcer. Within transfer trials, we still want to reinforce responding independently to the discriminative stimulus, even if it is within the transfer trial sequence, and even though we would still mark that the initial trial was incorrect or was a non-response. Also, as a reminder, we would likely not take data on either of the 2 transfer trial sequences that followed that initial trial. In the second video, the technician provided the discriminative stimulus of "do this" while tapping the wall. The child did not respond correctly to the first trial, so a prompt was provided. Then the technician immediately provided another independent opportunity to respond, which we then saw the child independently tap the wall. The technician provided a reinforcer and then scored the trial as incorrect. A place you usually see transfer trials is within the 4-step error correction in icon exchange communication system procedures. When you're working on phases 3 and 4, which go over and teach discrimination, the 4-step error correction is model, practice, distract, repeat. You model the response, so you prompt the response, and allow the student to practice within that prompted response. Then you usually, but not always, do a distractor trial, which again is an easy mastered task. And then you allow another opportunity for an independent response, which you reinforce if a correct response has then been made. As I stated earlier, a distractor trial is not required within transfer trials, but may occasionally be used. Now that we've gone over stimulus control, prompts, prompt fading, and transfer trials, we will now relate them back to the implementation of stimulus control transfer procedures. To implement stimulus control transfer procedures, you would implement prompt fading or transfer trials. As a reminder, prompt fading, both response and stimulus prompt fading, involves fading the control of the response from the prompt to the desired discriminative stimulus. Transfer trials involves transferring control of the response from the prompt to the desired discriminative stimulus without systematically fading the prompt. This is done by providing another opportunity for an independent response after the prompted response. In this presentation, we discussed stimulus control and discrimination training, prompting methods including stimulus and response prompting, prompt fading methods, and these were related back to implementing stimulus control transfer procedures. Many books and articles were referenced in the making of this presentation. If you would like additional information, please check any of these resources out. This concludes the module on C8, which was implementing stimulus control transfer procedures, and C9, which was implementing prompt and prompt fading procedures, which are both part of the skill acquisition category in the RBT task list.